Who were the Olmecs, and how did a rainforest people become the first civilization to shape Mesoamerica? Long before cities or writing, they carved stone, honoured unseen forces, and lived by ritual and balance. Tonight, we explore their world and lasting influence. And before we begin, please like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The Rainforests, where the Olmecs first emerged. Long before stone cities rose in the Americas, before calendars carved time into cycles, before kings claimed descent from gods, there existed a world shaped almost entirely by water, heat, and green silence. It was a land where rivers braided through dense forest, where mist clung to leaves at dawn, and where the earth itself seemed alive beneath every step. This was the Olmec world before it had a name. The southern Gulf Coast of what is now Mexico was not an easy place to live. Thick rainforests pressed inward from every direction, tangled with vines and towering trees that blocked the sun. The air was heavy, warm, and wet, carrying the constant scent of soil and growing things. Rain fell often, sometimes gently, sometimes in sudden pounding storms that swelled rivers and reshaped the land overnight. Yet it was here, in this demanding landscape, that the first great civilization of Mesoamerica quietly emerged. The rainforest did not invite settlement. They tested it. Rivers overflowed without warning, turning familiar paths into shifting channels. Insects filled the air. Heat pressed down day and night. Food was abundant, but only for those who understood the rhythms of water, soil, and season. Survival required observation, patience, and cooperation with forces far larger than any individual. Those who lived here learned to listen to the land. They settled along rivers not because it was convenient, but because it was necessary. Waterways became lifelines, carrying fish, fertile silt, and connection between distant communities. Canoes slipped through narrow channels beneath overhanging branches, moving people and goods long before roads existed. The rainforest shaped how the earliest Olmecs thought. It taught them that the world was layered, sky above, earth below, and a dense, breathing realm in between. Sounds travelled differently here. Visibility was limited. Shapes appeared and vanished in shadow. Animals emerged suddenly, then disappeared without trace. Life felt close to the unseen. This environment nurtured a worldview where nature and spirit were inseparable. The Olmecs did not arrive suddenly as a civilization. They emerged gradually from earlier communities who had lived in the region for thousands of years. These people hunted, fished, and gathered along the coast and inland rivers. Over time, they learned which plants could be domesticated, which floods brought renewal rather than destruction, and how to shape small clearings within the forest without fighting it entirely. Maize would later become central to their world, but even before agriculture fully took root, the rainforest provided abundance. Fish from rivers, shellfish from the coast, fruit from trees, and animals from forest and wetland alike. The land demanded balance. Clear too much forest, and the soil washed away. Ignore the floods, and settlements vanished. Respect the cycles, however, and the rainforest rewarded those who understood it. Gradually, small communities began to grow larger and more permanent. Villages clustered near rivers where trade and communication were easiest. Families passed down knowledge, when to plant, when to move, when to prepare for storms. Memory mattered as much as strength. In time, something new began to take shape. Certain places became more than villages. They became centres. These early Olmec centres did not rise because of conquest, but because of geography and meaning. Elevated ground near rivers provided safety from floods. Natural features, hills, springs, unusual rock formations, attracted attention. The rainforest itself seemed to mark certain places as special. People gathered there not only to live, but to meet, exchange, and perform rituals. The rainforest amplified these gatherings. Sounds of drums echoed strangely through trees. Fires glowed softly beneath thick canopies. Smoke curled upward and vanished into leaves, carrying prayers into a sky rarely seen clearly from below. In this world, leadership did not announce itself loudly. It emerged through coordination, organizing labor, managing food, guiding ritual. Those who could read the land and the people gained influence. Power grew quietly, rooted in knowledge rather than force. The rainforest protected the Olmecs even as it challenged them. It concealed their settlements from distant outsiders. It slowed movement, making invasion difficult. It forced any society that wished to thrive here to adapt fully or fail. This isolation allowed Olmec culture to develop in its own direction, shaped less by foreign influence and more by intimate interaction with environment. Stone was rare in the lowlands but not absent. Far to the west and south, volcanic highlands rose beyond the rainforest. From there came basalt, heavy, dark stone that would later be shaped into the colossal heads for which the Olmecs are famous. Even in this earliest phase, the rainforest set the terms. Transporting stone required rivers, planning, and collective effort. Nothing happened quickly here. Everything required time, coordination, and patience. The rainforest slowed human ambition and forced it to mature. As centuries passed, the Olmec heartland grew more interconnected. River networks became arteries of culture. Ideas travelled along water as much as goods. Symbols began to repeat across distant settlements. Shared beliefs took shape, reflecting common experience of rain, fertility, danger, and renewal. The rainforest did not separate communities. It connected them through shared challenge. Animals played a central role in how the Olmecs understood this world. Jaguars moved silently through the forest, powerful and unseen. Snakes slipped between water and land. Birds crossed canopy and sky. These creatures embodied the layers of existence the rainforest revealed every day. To live here was to believe the world was alive. Storms felt intentional. Rivers felt conscious. The forest watched. This belief would later shape Olmec religion, art and kingship, but its roots lay here, in the daily reality of navigating a land that did not yield easily to human will. The rainforest was not something to conquer, it was something to understand, and in learning to live within it, the Olmecs laid the foundation for everything that followed. Their cities, their art, their gods, and their lasting influence on all later Mesoamerican civilizations. Long before history recorded their name, the rainforest had already shaped their minds. It whispered patience, it demanded respect, and it gave rise, slowly and quietly, to the first civilization of the Americas. As generations passed within this dense green world, the relationship between people and rainforest deepened into something more deliberate. What had once been survival slowly became stewardship. The Olmecs did not simply endure the rainforest, they learned how to shape their lives around its moods, accepting its power while gently guiding its abundance. Settlements grew where land rose just enough above floodwaters. Earthen platforms were built, lifting homes and communal spaces away from seasonal inundation. These platforms were not imposed harshly on the land. They followed its contours, blending into the surrounding environment. From a distance, they appeared almost natural, as if the earth itself had risen slightly to meet human need. Daily life moved to the rhythm of water. Rivers dictated when people travelled, when they fished, and when they gathered. Canoes became extensions of the body, gliding through narrow channels with practiced ease. Children learned currents as naturally as paths. Elders remembered floods from decades past, warning when water would rise again. Food came from many sources, each tied to the rainforest's cycles. Fish filled nets during certain seasons. Shellfish came from coastal lagoons. Forest animals provided meat, while fruits, nuts, and roots offered variety. Early cultivation began carefully. Small clearings for maize, squash, and beans, tended without stripping the forest bare. This approach created resilience. Rather than relying on a single source of food, the Olmecs drew from many, reducing risk. If floods destroyed crops, fishing sustained them. If drought reduced river life, forest resources compensated. The rainforest, when respected, became a partner rather than an enemy. Over time, shared rituals emerged to acknowledge this balance. Rain was not taken for granted. Storms could nourish or destroy. Ceremonies developed to honour the forces believed to control water and fertility. Fires were lit beneath the canopy, their glow muted by leaves above. Offerings were placed near springs and rivers, where water seemed to rise from the earth itself. These rituals did not separate daily life from belief. They were woven into it. The rainforest encouraged a worldview in which boundaries blurred between human and animal, land and spirit, present and ancestral past. Jaguars, powerful and elusive, embodied this merging. They moved silently through darkness, masters of both forest and riverbank. To the Olmecs, the jaguar was not just an animal, but a symbol of authority, transformation, and the unseen. This symbolism would later dominate Olmec art, but its origin lay here, in countless encounters with glowing eyes in the undergrowth, in tracks found near camps at dawn, in the sense that the forest itself was watching. As settlements expanded, certain places gained prominence. Elevated areas near river junctions attracted larger gatherings. People came not only to live, but to exchange goods, partners, and knowledge. These early centres were not cities yet, but they marked a shift, a move toward organised space and shared identity. Labour became communal. Clearing land, building platforms, and managing water required coordination. Leadership emerged through action rather than decree. Those who organised work, mediated disputes, and guided ritual gained respect. Authority remained connected to service and understanding of the land. The rainforest reinforced this model. No individual could dominate it alone. Cooperation was essential. This necessity shaped Olmec society long before monuments appeared. Stone, scarce in the lowlands, acquired special meaning. When basalt tools or objects arrived from distant highlands, they were valued not just for utility, but for the effort required to obtain them. Rivers once again made this possible. Heavy stone was floated downstream, guided patiently through twisting waterways. Each journey reinforced the idea that distance could be overcome through planning and collective effort. These early exchanges laid the groundwork for long-distance trade networks that would later define Olmec influence. The rainforest did not isolate the Olmecs from the wider world. It taught them how to move within it. Paths through dense vegetation were remembered rather than marked. Landmarks were trees, bends in rivers, changes in soil and sound. This knowledge was passed orally, embedding geography in memory rather than maps. Children learned stories that doubled as directions. Myths explained why certain places mattered, ensuring that practical knowledge survived across generations. In time, shared symbols began to appear, carved motifs, repeated shapes, familiar figures. These were not decoration alone, they were visual memory, reinforcing identity across distance. A person travelling far could recognise shared meaning carved into stone or shaped in clay. The rainforest amplified these symbols by limiting visibility. When something was seen clearly, it mattered. Gradually, the Olmecs began to transform space intentionally. Platforms grew larger. Central areas were cleared for gatherings. Earth was shaped not only for survival but for meaning. The landscape became a canvas of belief and memory. Yet the rainforest never disappeared. Even as human presence expanded, the forest pressed close. Trees grew back quickly where they were cut. Vines reclaimed unused spaces. The Olmecs did not attempt to banish the jungle. They accepted its persistence as part of life. This coexistence became a defining feature of Olmec civilization. Where later societies might impose rigid boundaries, the Olmecs lived within gradients: forest and clearing, river and land, human and animal. This fluidity shaped their art, their religion, and their understanding of power. By the time recognizable Olmec centers like San Lorenzo and Venta began to rise, the rainforest had already done its work. It had trained the people in patience, coordination, and reverence. It had taught them that greatness did not need to announce itself loudly. The Olmecs emerged not by conquering their environment, but by listening to it. And beneath the endless canopy, in the hush between rainfall and birdsong, the foundations of Mesoamerican civilization took root, quietly, deliberately, and in harmony with a world that never stopped growing. Before cities, life along rivers and wetlands, long before stone pyramids rose from cleared plazas, long before rulers marked their power in carved monuments, life for the early Olmecs unfolded quietly along rivers and wetlands. These waters were not edges of settlement, they were the centre of existence, shaping movement, memory, and meaning. The rivers of the Gulf lowlands did not flow gently. They shifted, widened, narrowed, and overflowed according to seasons that were learned through observation rather than measurement. Some years brought generous floods that renewed soil and filled channels with fish. Other years tested patience, forcing communities to adapt without warning. To live here was to accept uncertainty as normal. Homes were built with this understanding. Structures were light, flexible, and easily repaired. Walls of woven reeds and wood stood atop raised earthen platforms. Roofs of palm leaves shed rain quickly. Nothing was meant to last forever, because permanence was not the goal. Continuity mattered more than durability. Families lived close to water, but never carelessly close. Knowledge passed down through generations taught where floods would reach and where ground remained firm. Children learned these lessons early, absorbing geography through lived experience rather than instruction. Wetlands provided abundance that the forest alone could not. Fish moved through shallow channels in dense numbers. Nets, traps, and spears were used skillfully, adjusted for different species and water levels. Shellfish gathered from lagoons added protein and variety. Aquatic plants offered food, fibre, and material for tools. Hunting along riverbanks complemented this diet. Animals came to drink at predictable times, allowing hunters to plan rather than pursue endlessly. This balance between patience and action defined daily survival. Food was not hoarded unnecessarily. Excess spoiled quickly in heat and humidity. Instead, sharing reinforced community bonds. Meals became moments of connection. Stories exchanged beneath shelters while rain drummed softly above. Movement along waterways shaped social life. Canoes were essential, not optional. Crafted from hollowed logs or assembled from lighter materials, they allowed quiet travel through narrow channels hidden by vegetation. River travel was safer than cutting through dense forest, and it connected distant settlements more efficiently than any land path. Through these watery routes, ideas travelled as easily as goods. A tool design seen upriver appeared months later downstream. A ritual practiced near the coast echoed inland. Language remained shared across wide distances, reinforced by regular contact rather than centralized authority. Before cities existed, these networks created cohesion. Seasonal gatherings became important moments. Families and communities converged at known locations when water levels allowed easy access. These gatherings were not governed by walls or rulers. They emerged naturally from shared timing and need. At these meetings, marriages were arranged, disputes settled, rituals performed, and knowledge exchanged. The wetlands made such gatherings possible by offering open spaces amid dense forest where people could assemble without clearing land extensively. Agriculture began slowly, cautiously. The Olmecs did not abandon hunting and fishing when they began cultivating plants. Instead, they added small plots to their existing food strategies. Maize, squash, beans, and chili peppers were grown in raised areas less prone to flooding. Wetland soils, enriched by seasonal water, proved fertile when managed carefully. This mixed subsistence strategy reduced risk. If crops failed, fish and forests sustained life. If hunting was scarce, cultivated plants filled the gap. This flexibility allowed population growth without catastrophic collapse, reinforcing long-term stability. Wetlands also shaped belief. Water appeared to move with intention. Rivers flooded without visible cause. Springs emerged from earth mysteriously. Mist rose at dawn, as if the land itself were breathing. To the Olmecs, these phenomena suggested a world animated by unseen forces. Ritual activity clustered near water. Offerings were placed at river bends, springs, and lagoons. Objects were submerged intentionally, given to the depths rather than destroyed. Water became a passage between realms, connecting human life to forces below and beyond sight. This spiritual relationship reinforced respect. Water was not owned. It was approached carefully, thanked, and feared in equal measure. Decisions about settlement and movement considered not only practicality, but perceived harmony with these forces. Leadership remained informal. Those who understood water patterns, soil behaviour, and seasonal timing gained influence. Elders who remembered past floods advised caution. Individuals skilled in negotiation coordinated shared labour. Authority flowed from competence and trust rather than command. The wetlands discouraged rigid hierarchy. No individual could control the rivers. No family could dominate resources permanently. Cooperation remained essential, reinforcing social balance. Over generations, memory accumulated. Stories encoded practical knowledge, tales explaining why certain places were avoided or respected. Myths doubled as maps, guiding behaviour subtly. In this way, survival knowledge became culture. As population density increased along waterways, the need for coordination grew. Paths were cleared lightly, platforms expanded, communal spaces took shape. Yet even then, these were not cities. They were living landscapes, adaptable, responsive, and deeply embedded in water and soil. The Olmecs did not yet think in terms of domination over land. They thought in terms of relationship, and it was this relationship, with rivers that nourished and destroyed, wetlands that fed and challenged, and cycles that demanded humility, that prepared them for what would come next. Before cities rose, before stone monuments marked power, the Olmecs learned how to live together along moving water. That lesson would shape everything that followed. As years folded into generations, life along the rivers and wetlands grew more intricate without ever becoming rigid. The Olmecs learned that water was not a background element of life, but its quiet architect. It shaped not only where people lived, but how they thought about time, memory, and belonging. Seasonality governed everything. There were periods when the rivers expanded, swallowing familiar banks and turning open ground into reflective sheets of water. During these times, movement slowed, fishing intensified, travel routes changed, remembered not by landmarks, but by the feel of current and depth beneath a canoe. Families stayed closer together, repairing tools, sharing food, and retelling stories that anchored them while the landscape transformed. Then the waters receded. Mud left behind by floods enriched the soil, dark and fertile. New growth followed quickly. Birds returned in large numbers. Fish spawned in shallows newly exposed. This cycle taught patience. Destruction was never final. Renewal was always near. Children grew up watching the land change its shape. They learned that nothing stayed fixed, and that adaptability was not weakness but wisdom. This understanding became deeply embedded in Olmec identity. Stability did not come from permanence, but from knowing when to move, when to wait, and when to act. Homes reflected this philosophy. Materials were chosen for availability and renewal rather than longevity. Wood, reeds, and clay could be gathered again after storms. Structures were repaired communally, reinforcing bonds through shared effort. There was no shame in rebuilding. It was expected. Wetlands also encouraged craftsmanship. Reeds became baskets and mats. Clay from riverbanks was shaped into vessels for cooking and storage. Simple but effective tools emerged: fishing weights, hooks, blades, refined through repeated use rather than sudden invention. Craft knowledge travelled through observation. Skills were not guarded closely. They were shared openly within families and across communities. A successful technique spread quickly along waterways, carried by travellers who demonstrated rather than explained. Trade existed, but not as later societies would define it. Exchange was personal, relational, and based on trust. A canoe arriving from afar brought not only goods, but news of water levels, animal migrations, distant gatherings. Objects carried stories with them, embedding distant places into local awareness. Through these networks, a shared Olmec culture slowly emerged. It was not imposed from a centre. It formed organically from repeated interaction. Language stabilised. Symbols gained shared meaning. Ritual practices aligned across regions, reflecting common experience of water, fertility, and danger. As wetlands shaped daily life, they also shaped how the Olmecs viewed the unseen. Water concealed as much as it revealed. Depths were dark. Creatures emerged suddenly from beneath the surface. Sounds carried strangely across water at night. This mystery encouraged belief in layered worlds, one above, one below, and one unseen in between. Shamans or spiritual specialists likely arose from those most attuned to these boundaries. They interpreted dreams, led rituals, and mediated between visible and invisible realms. Their authority came not from force, but from perceived closeness to the rhythms of land and water. Early ceremonial spaces appeared near wetlands. These were not grand temples yet, but places set apart, slightly raised areas, cleared of vegetation, where people gathered for communal rites. Offerings were placed carefully, sometimes buried, sometimes submerged, acknowledging forces beyond human control. These practices reinforced cohesion. They reminded communities that survival depended on harmony among people and between people and environment. As populations grew, conflicts inevitably arose. Disputes over fishing spots, fertile ground, or access routes occurred. Resolution relied on negotiation rather than violence. Violence disrupted balance and risked collective survival. Elders and respected individuals mediated, drawing on memory and precedent. This approach prevented fragmentation. Communities remained interconnected rather than isolated. Alliances formed through marriage and ritual participation. Identity expanded beyond immediate family to include wider networks along rivers and wetlands. Gradually, certain locations became central, places where multiple waterways converged, where seasonal gatherings occurred regularly, where ritual significance accumulated over time. These sites gained permanence not through walls, but through memory and repeated use. People returned to them generation after generation. Here, earthworks began to grow larger, platforms were raised higher, communal spaces became more defined. These changes were subtle, but they marked a transition. Life along rivers had prepared the Olmecs for coordination on a larger scale. They had learned patience from floods, cooperation from rebuilding, foresight from seasonal change. These lessons would soon allow them to organize labor beyond the household, shaping landscapes intentionally rather than reactively. Yet even as complexity increased, the wetlands remained central. They continued to feed, connect, and challenge the Olmecs. They resisted total control, reminding people of limits. This tension between human intention and environmental power became a defining feature of Olmec civilization. Before cities rose, before stone monuments claimed permanence, the Olmecs lived within moving water. They learned that life could be rich without being rigid, structured without being confined. That lesson would echo through everything they built. Next, and as the rivers flowed onward, carrying silt and memory alike, they carried the Olmecs toward the birth of civilization, quietly, patiently, and without walls. The birth of the first Mesoamerican civilization. The birth of a civilization does not arrive with a single moment, nor with a sudden declaration of greatness. It unfolds quietly, through small changes that accumulate across generations, until one day the world has become something new. For the Olmecs, this transformation emerged from habits already learned: cooperation, memory, ritual, and respect for forces larger than themselves. Long before they built monuments, the Olmecs had already built relationships. Their communities were bound together by rivers, wetlands, and shared experience. What changed was not the land itself, but how people began to organize within it. Tasks once handled by families expanded into collective efforts. Knowledge once held by elders became structured into shared tradition. Rituals once practiced locally grew into regional expressions of belief. This was the beginning of civilization. As population increased, the need for coordination grew with it. Clearing land, raising platforms, and managing food surplus required planning beyond the household. People began to work together, not just because survival demanded it, but because shared labour created shared identity. Leadership took clearer form. Those who demonstrated skill in organising work, guiding ceremonies, and resolving disputes gained lasting influence. Their authority was reinforced through success: harvests protected from floods, gatherings conducted without conflict, rituals believed to ensure rain and fertility. Power was still subtle, but it was becoming visible. Settlements expanded and stabilized. Villages that had once shifted seasonally now remained occupied year-round. Paths became familiar routes. Gathering places turned into permanent communal spaces. Earthworks rose slowly, layer by layer, shaped by human hands guided by memory. These early centres were not cities yet, but they were something new. Places where people gathered not only to live, but to belong. Ritual life intensified. As communities grew larger, rituals became more formalized. Certain locations were reserved for ceremonial use. Offerings increased in scale and complexity. Symbols repeated more consistently, reinforcing shared meaning across distance. These symbols reflected the Olmec worldview, one shaped by rainforest, river, and animal life. Jaguars, serpents, birds, and composite beings appeared in early carvings and objects, representing forces that moved between worlds. The Olmecs did not separate religion from governance. Spiritual authority and social leadership intertwined. Those who led rituals often guided communal decisions. This integration provided stability, aligning practical needs with belief systems that encouraged cooperation and restraint. Surplus production made specialization possible. Not everyone needed to hunt or fish every day. Some individuals focused on crafting tools, shaping clay, or carving stone. Others refined ritual knowledge or maintained trade connections. This division of labour increased efficiency and allowed cultural expression to flourish. Trade networks expanded. Goods moved farther and more frequently along river routes. Basalt from distant highlands, jade from faraway sources, and shells from the coast circulated through Olmec territory. These materials were not valued only for rarity, but for the stories they carried, evidence of connection beyond the immediate world. With trade came influence. Ideas spread alongside goods. Artistic styles aligned. Ritual practices echoed across regions. The Olmecs did not impose their culture through conquest. It spread because it resonated with shared experience and offered coherence. Memory became formalized. Stories were no longer only family history. They became collective history. Ancestral figures were remembered, honoured, and referenced in ritual. Lineage gained importance, linking present leadership to revered past. This sense of continuity strengthened authority and identity. The landscape itself began to reflect these changes. Earth was moved intentionally, not only for protection from floods, but to shape space for ceremony and gathering. Platforms grew larger. Open areas were cleared deliberately. These actions transformed natural features into cultural landmarks. Yet the Olmecs did not erase the natural world. Forest remained close. Water continued to flow freely. Civilization emerged within nature, not against it. This balance distinguished the Olmecs from later societies that sought rigid control over environment. Art became more expressive. Early carvings and objects showed increasing skill and symbolism. Faces appeared, stylized, powerful, serene. These were not portraits in the modern sense, but representations of authority, ancestry, and transformation. Stone began to carry memory. Carved objects endured longer than wood or reed. They preserved belief across generations. In shaping stone, the Olmecs anchored their identity in material form. Time itself took on new meaning. Cycles were observed more carefully. Seasonal patterns were linked to ritual calendars. Events were remembered not just as personal experience, but as part of collective rhythm. Civilization requires shared time, and the Olmecs were learning to measure it through repetition rather than numbers. As these changes accumulated, the Olmecs crossed an invisible threshold. They had become something more than a network of villages. They were now a civilization, one defined not by walls or writing, but by shared belief, organized labor, enduring symbols, and regional influence. This transformation was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, guided by environment and memory, and because it emerged organically, it proved resilient. The Olmecs did not yet know the legacy they were creating. They did not see themselves as founders of Mesoamerica's future. They were simply responding to the needs of their world, drawing on lessons learned from rivers and rainforests. But in doing so, they laid the foundation for everything that followed. The first Mesoamerican civilization had been born, quietly, patiently, and without proclamation. As this new way of life took hold, the Olmec world began to feel different, even to those living within it. There was a growing sense that certain places mattered more than others, not simply because of geography, but because of memory layered upon memory. A clearing where rituals had been held for generations felt heavier with meaning than untouched forest. An earthen platform raised by many hands carried the presence of all who had shaped it. These places became anchors. People returned to them repeatedly, orienting their lives around familiar centres. Over time, These centres accumulated not only people, but authority. Decisions made there carried greater weight. Rituals performed there were believed to reach further into the unseen world. This was how hierarchy began, not through force, but through repetition and belief. Those associated with these central places gained prestige. Families connected to ritual leadership or ancestral memory came to be regarded with particular respect. Their words carried influence because they were believed to speak with the backing of tradition and spiritual insight. Power remained restrained, but it was no longer invisible. As coordination increased, so did ambition, though ambition expressed itself carefully. Large projects were undertaken only when they aligned with shared values. Earthworks expanded gradually. Platforms were raised higher and more precisely shaped. Open spaces were defined where gatherings could occur without obstruction. These projects required planning across seasons. Labour had to be organised around floods, harvests, and ritual calendars. This necessity reinforced leadership roles and strengthened communal discipline. Participation became an expectation, not because of coercion, but because shared effort reinforced shared identity. The Olmecs were learning to think collectively. Art and symbolism played a crucial role in this transformation. Images carved into stone or shaped from clay communicated ideas without words. They reminded people of shared beliefs, common ancestry, and the forces governing their world. Certain motifs appeared again and again. The jaguar, powerful and liminal, embodied authority and transformation. Serpents represented movement between realms, between water and land, life and death. Birds symbolized sky and vision beyond the forest canopy. These creatures were not decorative, they were conceptual tools, helping people understand their place in a layered universe. As these symbols spread, so did Olmec influence. Communities beyond the core region adopted Olmec styles and practices, integrating them into local traditions. This was not conquest, it was attraction. The Olmec way offered coherence, a shared language of meaning that connected diverse groups. Trade networks supported this cultural expansion. Basalt, jade, obsidian, and shell moved along established routes. Each exchange reinforced relationships. Each object carried not only material value, but cultural significance. Receiving an Olmec-style object signalled participation in a wider world. With this expansion came greater complexity. Managing relationships across distance required diplomacy. Ritual gatherings grew larger and more formal. Leadership structures became clearer, though still flexible. Authority was reinforced through successful coordination rather than violence. The absence of large-scale warfare during this period is striking. The Olmec environment discouraged sustained conflict. Dense forest and wetlands made prolonged campaigns difficult. More importantly, the social system valued balance and continuity over domination. Conflict threatened survival more than it promised gain. This restraint shaped Olmec civilization profoundly. Rather than fortifications and armies, they invested in ritual, art, and social cohesion. Rather than conquering land, they shaped meaning. This approach allowed them to influence regions far beyond their physical reach. Time deepened these patterns. Generations grew up knowing only this organized world. What had once been innovation became tradition. Children learned roles and expectations early, absorbing identity through participation rather than instruction. The memory of earlier, simpler life did not disappear. It was preserved in stories, rituals, and symbolic references to ancestors who had lived closer to forest and river. This continuity helped maintain humility. Civilization was not seen as separation from nature, but as a more complex relationship with it. Even as Olmec centers grew, the rainforest pressed close. Trees reclaimed unused spaces quickly. Water continued to flood unpredictably. These forces reminded people of limits. Civilization remained negotiable, adaptable, and responsive. This balance may explain the Olmecs' endurance. They did not build brittle systems that collapsed under pressure. They built flexible networks that could adjust to change. When floods altered landscapes, settlements adapted. When trade routes shifted, relationships evolved. Civilization here was not static. It breathed, expanded, and contracted like the environment that shaped it. As centuries passed, the Olmecs became aware of themselves as a people distinct from others. This awareness was not written, but expressed through art, ritual, and shared practice. Identity solidified without rigid boundaries. They had become the first Mesoamerican civilization, not by declaring it, but by living it. Their influence would outlast their dominance. Later cultures would draw on Olmec symbolism, ritual structure, and worldview, often without knowing their source. In this way, the Olmecs became foundational rather than famous. The birth of civilization here did not announce itself with stone cities or written records. It emerged quietly, through cooperation, belief, memory, and respect for a world that never fully yielded. And as the rainforest continued to grow and rivers continued to shift, the Olmec civilization settled into its role, not as conqueror of nature, but as its thoughtful participant. From this foundation, everything else would follow. San Lorenzo, Venta, and the sacred Olmec centers. As the Olmec world matured, certain places began to stand apart from all others. They were not chosen at random, nor were they imposed by force. These centers emerged where land, water, memory, and belief quietly converged, becoming spaces where human intention and the natural world met in lasting harmony. Among these places, San Lorenzo and Venta rose as the most powerful expressions of Olmec civilization. San Lorenzo came first. Set upon a natural plateau rising gently above surrounding wetlands, San Lorenzo offered what the rainforest rarely did: stability. The land here stood high enough to remain dry through seasonal floods, yet close enough to rivers to remain connected. From this elevated ground, the Olmecs could see farther, plan farther, and gather more people than ever before. But San Lorenzo was more than a practical choice. It was shaped deliberately, its contours altered through immense communal effort. Earth was moved, terraces raised, channels carved to guide water away and protect the plateau. These actions required coordination across generations, a sign that leadership and organisation had reached a new level. The land itself became architecture. San Lorenzo did not rely on towering stone buildings. Instead, it reshaped the earth, creating platforms, courtyards, and ceremonial spaces that blended into the landscape. From above, the site followed a subtle order, not rigid symmetry, but intentional design responding to natural form. Water played a central role. Drainage systems carved from stone guided rainwater away from important areas, preventing erosion and flooding. This engineering reflected deep understanding of rainfall patterns and soil behaviour. It also symbolised control, not domination over water, but respectful management of it. Within this carefully shaped environment, ritual life intensified. San Lorenzo became a place where authority was made visible through ceremony. Gatherings here were larger, more formal, and more symbolic than those of earlier settlements. Offerings increased in number and significance. Objects of jade, basalt, and ceramic were placed deliberately, marking moments of collective meaning. It was here that the first colossal stone heads appeared. Carved from massive basalt boulders transported from distant highlands, these heads represented an unprecedented investment of labour and coordination. Each one required quarrying, shaping, transport by river, and careful placement. They were not anonymous faces. Each head carried distinct features: lips, noses, expressions, suggesting individual identity. These were likely representations of rulers or revered ancestors, immortalized in stone. Their scale conveyed authority, permanence, and presence. In a world where most materials decayed quickly, stone endured. The heads did not speak, but they watched. Their placement within San Lorenzo suggested guardianship, overseeing. Ceremonial spaces, anchoring memory in physical form, they transformed leadership from a lived experience into a lasting image. San Lorenzo became a centre not only of power, but of influence. Artistic styles developed here spread outward along trade routes. Symbols carved in stone appeared in distant communities. Ritual practices observed at San Lorenzo were echoed elsewhere. The site functioned as a cultural heart, radiating meaning beyond its immediate boundaries. Yet San Lorenzo's dominance did not last forever. Environmental changes, shifts in river courses, flooding patterns, and possibly climate altered the plateau's suitability. Over time, activity diminished. The Olmecs did not abandon the site abruptly, but gradually redirected their focus. This transition led to the rise of Venta. Venta emerged farther east, closer to the coast, situated on a narrow ridge surrounded by wetlands. At first glance, the location seems improbable, exposed, humid, and difficult to access. Yet this very isolation enhanced its significance. Venta was not chosen for convenience alone, it was chosen for symbolism. Here, the Olmecs created one of the most carefully planned ceremonial landscapes of the ancient world. The site followed a north-south axis, aligning space with cosmological belief. Earthworks were raised with remarkable precision, shaping plazas, platforms, and mounds that structured movement and ritual. At Venta, the sacred took centre stage. Unlike San Lorenzo, where daily life and ritual intermingled, Venta emphasized ceremony. Large portions of the site appear reserved for ritual use rather than habitation. This suggests a shift, a clearer separation between sacred and everyday space. The Great Pyramid of Venta, constructed entirely of earth, rose from the flat wetlands as a symbolic mountain. Though eroded today, it once dominated the landscape, visible from afar. In a land without natural peaks, this artificial mound carried profound meaning. Mountains were places of power. They connected earth and sky, human and divine. By building a mountain where none existed, the Olmecs reshaped not just land, but cosmology. Buried offerings beneath Venta's plazas reveal layers of ritual practice. Massive deposits of jade, serpentine, and other precious materials were placed carefully in patterned arrangements, then covered and sealed. These offerings were not meant to be retrieved. They were gifts to unseen forces, acts of devotion and communication. The effort involved was extraordinary. Thousands of objects arranged meticulously, then hidden forever beneath earth. This speaks to belief systems where sacrifice and concealment held deep meaning. Value was not displayed for status alone, it was given away to sustain cosmic balance. Venta also continued the tradition of monumental stone sculpture. Colossal heads stood here as well, alongside altars and stelae depicting rulers emerging from caves or interacting with supernatural beings. These images reinforced the idea that leadership flowed from divine connection rather than human ambition. The sacred centres were not cities in the later sense. They were focal points, places people travelled to rather than lived within permanently. Pilgrimages likely occurred during specific times of year, aligned with ritual calendars and seasonal cycles. This pattern maintained balance. The Olmecs avoided overcrowding sacred space. By keeping daily life dispersed and ritual centralized, they preserved both flexibility and cohesion. San Lorenzo and Venta together represent different phases of Olmec civilization. San Lorenzo embodied emergence, experimentation, early authority, and integration of daily life and ritual. Venta embodied refinement, symbolism, cosmology, and formalized sacred space. Both were shaped by the same principles: respect for land, understanding of water, belief in unseen forces, commitment to communal effort. These centres did not dominate through walls or armies. They drew people inward through meaning, and in doing so, they set a pattern that later Mesoamerican civilizations would follow. Cities as sacred landscapes, power expressed through ritual, and monuments built not only to rule the living, but to speak to eternity. As people continued to gather at these sacred centres, their presence transformed the surrounding landscape in ways both visible and subtle. The journey to San Lorenzo or La Venta was itself part of the ritual experience. Travellers moved along rivers and raised paths, passing through wetlands and forest, gradually leaving behind the rhythms of daily life. By the time they arrived, they had already entered a different state of mind. Arrival mattered. Stepping onto the elevated platforms, crossing into open plazas, and standing before monumental forms marked a transition from the ordinary to the sacred. The Olmecs understood that space could shape feeling. Wide plazas encouraged collective focus. Narrow approaches slowed movement and heightened anticipation. Every pathway guided both body and thought. Ceremonies unfolded with deliberate pacing. Music echoed softly. Drums, rattles, and wind instruments blending with the sounds of insects and distant water. Fires burned steadily, their smoke rising and dispersing beneath the open sky. Leaders and ritual specialists moved with practiced restraint, their gestures slow and meaningful. These moments reinforced social order. Seeing leaders framed by monumental stone and earthworks made authority tangible. Yet this authority was not enforced through fear. It was affirmed through shared participation. Everyone present witnessed the same rites, heard the same chants, and felt themselves part of something larger. The sacred centres functioned as mirrors of the Olmec worldview. They reflected a universe organised in layers: sky above, earth below, and a middle realm inhabited by humans and animals. The verticality of platforms and mounds symbolised this structure, descending into buried offerings and rising toward elevated spaces mirrored movement between realms. Time itself was marked here. Ritual calendars likely guided gatherings, aligned with seasonal cycles of rain, planting, and harvest. These rhythms reinforced continuity. Each return to the centre renewed bonds between past, present, and future. San Lorenzo and La Venta also acted as repositories of memory. Objects placed within these centres, whether displayed or buried, carried stories. A jade figurine might represent an ancestor. A carved altar might commemorate a pivotal event. Over generations, these objects accumulated meaning, layering history into the earth itself. This accumulation created permanence in a world otherwise defined by change. While homes decayed and wetlands shifted, sacred centres endured. Their continued presence anchored Olmec identity across time. The influence of these centres extended far beyond their immediate boundaries. Communities hundreds of kilometres away adopted Olmec motifs and rituals, aligning themselves symbolically with these sacred landscapes. This alignment offered legitimacy and connection. By echoing Olmec forms, distant groups participated in a shared cosmological order. This spread was not enforced. There is no evidence of armies marching outward from San Lorenzo or La Venta. Instead, influence flowed through attraction. The sacred centres offered meaning, structure, and continuity in a complex world. Leadership evolved alongside this influence. Rulers became mediators between people and the sacred. Their role was not to command, but to maintain balance. Success was measured not by expansion, but by harmony, stable harvests, peaceful gatherings, and effective ritual. When environmental conditions changed, leadership adapted. The decline of San Lorenzo was not treated as failure, but as transition. Attention shifted smoothly toward La Venta, suggesting an understanding that sacred power could move without shattering social order. This adaptability prevented collapse. The Olmecs did not tie their identity to a single place. Instead, they tied it to principles embodied by those places: coordination, reverence, and continuity. Over time, new centres would rise and others would fade, but the pattern remained. Sacred landscapes would continue to anchor Mesoamerican civilization for millennia. The Maya, Zapotec, and later cultures inherited this model, building cities that were as much ceremonial as they were residential. The Olmecs provided the blueprint. They demonstrated that civilization could be organized around meaning rather than domination. That power could be expressed through ritual rather than conquest. That monuments could speak softly yet endure. As dusk fell over San Lorenzo and La Venta, the wetlands around them shimmered with reflected sky. Fires dimmed, voices quieted. People departed slowly, carrying the experience back to their homes along rivers and forest edges. The centres remained, silent, elevated and watchful. They held memory in earth and stone, waiting for the next gathering, the next cycle, the next generation. Through these sacred places, the Olmecs shaped not only their own world, but the future of an entire region. And though centuries would pass, and forests would reclaim much of what was built, the influence of San Lorenzo and La Venta would never fully fade, embedded deeply in the foundations of Mesoamerican civilization itself. The colossal stone heads and their silent faces. Among all that the Olmecs left behind, nothing speaks more quietly and more powerfully than the colossal stone heads. They do not tell stories in words. They do not move or gesture, yet their presence feels unmistakably human, as if they are watching from a distance of thousands of years. They have faces frozen in time, carved from massive blocks of basalt. Each head weighs many tons. The stone itself came from far away, quarried in the volcanic highlands and transported across rivers, wetlands and dense forest. This journey alone required immense coordination, patience and collective effort, a reminder that these heads were never casual creations. Nothing about them was accidental. The stone was chosen carefully, the roots were planned slowly, the carving was deliberate, measured and precise. In a world without metal tools, without wheels, without beasts of burden, these monuments emerged through persistence rather than force. The rainforest did not give up such stone easily. Basalt lay far from the Olmec heartland, embedded in rugged terrain. Extracting it meant cutting, shaping, and loosening enormous blocks using stone tools, water and fire. Transporting it meant floating it along rivers, guiding it through winding channels, protecting it from sinking or shattering. Every stage required cooperation. The journey of a single stone head may have taken months, even years. Along the way, entire communities would have participated, clearing paths, stabilizing rafts, guiding movement, repairing damage. The act of transport itself became ritualized, reinforcing shared purpose. When the stone finally arrived at a sacred center, its transformation began. Carving was not rushed. The faces emerged slowly, guided by skilled hands and practiced vision. The sculptors did not idealize youth or exaggerate power. Instead, they carved calm authority. Broad noses, full lips, steady eyes. Each face is distinct. This individuality suggests that the heads represent specific people, not generic gods. Differences in features, headgear, and expression hint at unique identities, perhaps rulers, leaders, or revered ancestors. These were individuals remembered not for conquest, but for significance within community memory. The helmets carved atop many heads add another layer of meaning. They may represent protective gear worn during ritual ball games or warfare. They may symbolize status, role, or lineage. Whatever their purpose, they ground the figures in lived reality rather than abstraction. These were human faces, yet their scale transforms them. Standing several meters tall, the heads elevate human presence to monumental proportion. They do not dominate through aggression. They dominate through stillness. Their silence invites contemplation rather than fear. Placed strategically within sacred centers, the heads interacted with space. They faced plazas, pathways, or ceremonial areas, becoming witnesses to gatherings and rituals. Their gaze followed movement, anchoring memory in place. Over time, generations would have passed before these faces, knowing they represented continuity beyond individual lifespans. Stone made memory permanent. In a world where homes decayed and landscapes shifted, these faces endured. They preserved authority after death. They allowed leadership to remain present even as individuals passed into ancestry. The heads did not exist alone. They were part of a broader visual language that included altars, stelae, and smaller carvings. Together, these forms created a narrative environment, one where leadership, ritual, and belief were reinforced visually rather than verbally. The silence of the stone heads was intentional. They did not explain themselves. They did not instruct directly. Their meaning was understood through shared culture. To those within Olmec society, these faces spoke volumes. To outsiders, they invited curiosity and reverence. Their creation also marked a shift in Olmec civilization. Investing so much labour in monuments signalled surplus, stability, and confidence. It meant that the community could support specialists, sculptors, organisers, ritual leaders, without threatening survival. The heads were proof of collective capacity. They demonstrated that the Olmecs could mobilise people across distance and time. They reflected a society capable of planning for generations rather than seasons. And yet, the faces remain restrained. They do not smile or scowl dramatically. They do not boast. Their expressions suggest composure, authority grounded in balance rather than dominance. This restraint mirrors the Olmec approach to power. Leadership as stewardship, not spectacle. Weather has softened their features over centuries. Rain has worn edges smooth. Moss has crept into crevices. Sunlight has bleached stone unevenly. And yet the faces remain recognisable, their presence undiminished. They feel patient, as if they have always known they would outlast the world that created them. Even today, standing before these heads evokes a sense of being observed, not judged, simply acknowledged, as if the past is aware of the present, watching quietly, without demand. The Olmecs did not leave written records explaining these monuments. They trusted that stone itself would speak, and it does, across time, across silence, across the long arc of human memory. As the colossal heads settled into their places within the sacred centres, they began a second life, not as objects being made, but as presences being lived with. From that moment on, they were no longer tools of labour or feats of engineering. They became part of the social and spiritual landscape, shaping how people moved, gathered, and remembered. Daily life unfolded beneath their gaze. People passed by them on the way to ceremonies, markets, and meetings. Children grew up knowing these faces as constants, as familiar as the river, bends, or forest paths. Elders pointed to them when telling stories of past leaders, victories of balance rather than battle, times when the community had survived flood, famine, or change. The heads became anchors of time. They marked continuity in a world where so much was transient. Homes were rebuilt, paths shifted, rivers changed course, but the stone faces remained steady and unmoving, reminding the living that they were part of a lineage stretching far behind them. Their placement was deliberate. The Olmecs understood sight lines. Heads were positioned to face important approaches, ceremonial plazas or ritual pathways. As people entered these spaces, they were met first by the faces of those who had come before, a subtle reminder that authority was inherited, not invented anew. This arrangement shaped behaviour. One did not act carelessly in the presence of ancestors. One spoke thoughtfully, moved respectfully. The silent faces enforced social order without words or weapons. The scale of the heads also changed perception. Standing before them, individuals were dwarfed, reminded of their smallness within a larger whole. This was not meant to humiliate, but to orient. Power was something beyond any single person, something accumulated through service, memory, and continuity. The heads embodied this idea perfectly. They did not depict bodies, only faces. Identity mattered more than physical strength. Expression mattered more than action. The absence of bodies stripped away narrative distraction, focusing attention entirely on presence. Faces are where humans seek meaning. The Olmecs understood this instinctively. The head's features were carved with care, emphasizing lips, eyes, and nose. The expressions are calm, almost introspective. They do not threaten, they do not plead, they simply exist. This calmness suggests confidence. Leaders represented here did not need to assert dominance. Their authority was already accepted, already woven into communal life. The monumentality of the heads reinforced this acceptance without spectacle. Over time, the heads themselves became ritual participants. Offerings may have been placed nearby. Ceremonies may have acknowledged them as intermediaries between the living and the ancestral realm. Though stone cannot hear, belief grants it presence. And belief was powerful. The Olmecs believed that ancestors remained active forces, capable of influencing rain, fertility, and fortune. Honouring them maintained balance. Neglect risked disruption. The heads ensured remembrance. They made forgetting impossible. Interestingly, not all heads remained prominently displayed forever. Some were buried intentionally, relocated, or even defaced. This was not random destruction. It suggests ritual closure, a controlled ending rather than abandonment. When leadership changed, when centres declined, monuments were treated carefully, even when removed from view. Burying a head was not erasing it, it was returning it to the earth, preserving it within the sacred landscape rather than exposing it to chaos. This act reflects the Olmec understanding of cycles, emergence and return, visibility and concealment. Stone heads followed these cycles just as people did. Their journey mirrored human life, emergence, presence, withdrawal, memory. This perspective challenges modern assumptions. Rather than viewing monuments as static symbols of power meant to dominate forever, the Olmecs treated them as participants in ongoing processes. Power was not fixed, it flowed. The heads also revealed the Olmec's relationship with individuality. Each face is unique, yet all share a common style. This balance between individuality and collective identity reflects Olmec society itself. People mattered, but always within community. Leaders stood out, but never apart. This philosophy would influence later Mesoamerican cultures profoundly. The Maya, Zapotec, and others would continue to memorialize rulers, ancestors, and sacred figures in stone. They inherited the Olmec insight that leadership is remembered through presence rather than proclamation. Today, these heads speak across millennia. They invite questions without answering them. Who were these individuals? What decisions did they make? How were they remembered by those who knew them personally? The silence is part of their power. It allows imagination to fill the gaps. It encourages reflection rather than conclusion. Standing before a colossal head, one feels not awe in the sense of fear, but recognition. These faces feel human. They remind us that the earliest civilizations were not abstract systems, but communities shaped by real people. People who led, served, remembered, and were remembered. The Olmecs carved their leaders not as conquerors, but as enduring presences. They trusted stone to hold memory when words could not. And so the silent faces remain, weathered, patient, and watchful, continuing to do what they were always meant to do, to remember, to witness, and to endure. Gods, shamans, and the Olmec spiritual world. In the Olmec world, the boundary between the visible and the unseen was never firmly drawn. The rainforest, the rivers, the animals, and the sky all seemed alive with intention, and human life unfolded within this living network rather than apart from it. To understand the Olmecs, one must understand that their spiritual world was not separate from daily existence. It was woven into every movement, decision, and breath. The Olmecs did not worship distant gods who lived far beyond reach. Their sacred forces were close, present, and active. They were felt in the sudden rise of floodwaters, in the rumble of thunder moving across wetlands, in the silent gaze of a jaguar slipping through the forest at dusk. These forces did not demand blind obedience. They demanded balance. The Olmecs believed the universe was layered. Above was the sky world, home of celestial forces, storms, and cycles beyond human control. Below lay the underworld, a realm of water, earth, fertility, and death. Between them existed the middle world, where humans, animals, and spirits interacted constantly. Movement between these layers was possible. Certain places, caves, springs, river mouths, and ceremonial centres were believed to serve as thresholds. Certain people, too, were thought capable of crossing these boundaries. These were the shamans. Shamans were not rulers in the political sense, though some leaders may also have held spiritual roles. Their power came from perceived ability to communicate with forces beyond the human realm. Through ritual, trance, and transformation, they acted as intermediaries between worlds. The rainforest shaped this belief deeply. Dense vegetation limited sight. Sounds travelled strangely. Shapes appeared and vanished in shadow. In such an environment, altered states of awareness felt natural rather than extraordinary. The unseen was never far away. Shamans entered these altered states deliberately. Through fasting, rhythm, chanting, and possibly the use of psychoactive plants, they sought visions that revealed hidden knowledge. These experiences were not personal journeys alone. They were undertaken for the community, to heal illness, predict seasons, restore balance, or guide ritual. Transformation was central to Olmec spirituality. Art repeatedly depicts figures merging human and animal traits. Jaguars with human features, humans with jaguar mouths or eyes. These images do not represent monsters. They represent movement between forms, the ability to cross boundaries that defined ordinary existence. The jaguar held special significance. As a creature of forest and night, strength and silence, land and water, the jaguar embodied liminality. It moved between realms effortlessly. To become jaguar-like was to gain access to power beyond human limitation. Shamans were often associated with jaguar imagery. Their role was not domination, but mediation. They ensured that humans remained aligned with cosmic forces rather than opposed to them. The Olmec gods were not neatly defined personalities. They were forces with multiple aspects, expressed through symbols rather than names. Rain, fertility, maize, fire, and earth were not separate deities in the modern sense. They were expressions of interdependent power. Maize in particular carried sacred meaning. It was not just food, it was life transformed by human care. Its growth depended on rain, soil, timing, and ritual. The maize god embodied renewal and dependency, a reminder that survival required cooperation between humans and the natural world. Storms were feared and revered. Thunder and lightning were signs of sky forces asserting themselves. Rain could nourish crops or destroy settlements. Rituals sought to maintain balance, not to command weather, but to align with it. Fire held a similar dual nature. It provided warmth, protection, and transformation, but also destruction. Sacred fires burned during ceremonies, acting as conduits between realms. Smoke carried offerings upward, while embers connected ritual space to earth. The Olmecs practiced ritual offering rather than sacrifice in the later violent sense. Objects of value, jade, stone tools, figurines, were placed carefully in earth or water. These offerings were not meant to be recovered. Their value lay in the act of giving, not display. This willingness to relinquish wealth reveals a worldview focused on balance rather than accumulation. Buried offerings were messages to the unseen, acknowledgements of dependence and gratitude. Sacred knowledge was not written. It was preserved through performance, through ritual sequences, repeated gestures, chants, and symbols. Memory was embodied rather than recorded. This made participation essential. One learned belief by doing, not reading. Children absorbed spirituality naturally. They watched rituals, listened to stories, observed how elders treated sacred places. Over time, belief became instinctive, inseparable from daily life. Leadership and spirituality intertwined. Rulers derived legitimacy from perceived spiritual alignment. Their authority depended on success in maintaining balance, ensuring rains came, harvests succeeded, and communities remained cohesive. Failure threatened not only political stability, but cosmic order. This belief restrained power. Leaders could not act purely for personal gain without risking spiritual consequence. Authority remained conditional, rooted in service rather than domination. Sacred centres reinforced this worldview. San Lorenzo and Venta were not merely political hubs. They were cosmological models, landscapes shaped to reflect the universe's structure. Movement through these spaces mirrored movement between realms. Descending into buried offerings symbolized entry into the underworld. Ascending platforms represented approach towards sky forces. The layout itself taught belief. The Olmec spiritual world was not abstract philosophy. It was lived reality, reinforced daily by environment, ritual, and memory. Every storm, every flood, every successful harvest reaffirmed the interconnectedness of life. The Olmecs did not seek to control the universe. They sought to remain in harmony with it, and through shamans, symbols, and sacred practice, they maintained that harmony, quietly, patiently, and with profound understanding. As this spiritual worldview deepened, it became clearer that Olmec belief was not organized around rigid doctrines or fixed scriptures. Instead, it lived in patterns of movement, sound, repetition, and space. Meaning emerged not from explanation, but from experience. Rituals followed rhythms rather than rules. They unfolded at certain times of year, aligned with rain cycles, planting seasons, and celestial movements that were observed rather than calculated. Participation mattered more than precision. To be present, to witness, to move together, these acts sustained belief. The Olmecs understood that repetition creates memory. By performing the same gestures year after year, generation after generation, Rituals embedded themselves into collective consciousness. No written record was needed. The body remembered. The land remembered. Shamans played a crucial role in maintaining this continuity. They were not isolated mystics, removed from society. They lived among the people, sharing daily life while carrying specialized knowledge. Their authority came not from secrecy alone, but from demonstrated effectiveness, healing the sick, interpreting dreams, guiding ceremonies through uncertain times. Illness was not viewed solely as physical. It was often understood as imbalance, a disruption between individual, community, and unseen forces. Healing rituals addressed all layers at once, combining herbs, chants, and symbolic acts. Recovery depended as much on restoring harmony as on physical treatment. Dreams held significance. They were considered messages from other realms, requiring interpretation. Shamans listened carefully to dream accounts, searching for patterns and symbols that might reveal guidance or warning. In this way, inner experience became a source of communal knowledge. The Olmec spiritual world was rich with symbolism. Caves represented entrances to the underworld. Springs marked places where life emerged from earth. Mountains, whether natural or built, connected sky and land. These symbols were not abstract metaphors. They were active sites of engagement. People travelled to them intentionally. Pilgrimages reinforced belief through physical effort. Reaching a sacred site required commitment, preparation, and endurance. The journey itself became part of the ritual, separating sacred experience from ordinary routine. Offerings varied in form and meaning. Some were small and personal, a figurine, a stone, a crafted object placed quietly. Others were collective, large caches of jade and stone arranged carefully and buried. The act of burial mattered as much as the object itself. To give something valuable and never retrieve it demonstrated trust. Trust that the unseen forces would respond. Trust that balance would be maintained. This practice reveals a society confident enough to relinquish wealth. Accumulation was not the ultimate goal. Stability was. Sacred art reinforced this worldview. Carvings depicted beings that blurred categories: human and animal, life and death, earth and sky. These images taught that boundaries were permeable. Transformation was possible. Nothing existed in isolation. This belief softened fear of change. Floods, droughts, death, and decline were not endings, but transitions within larger cycles. Ritual helped people navigate these transitions without panic or despair. Leadership was shaped by this understanding. Rulers were expected to embody balance. Their success was measured not by expansion or conquest, but by continuity. Predictable seasons, cohesive communities, and maintained ritual order. When disasters occurred, leadership was questioned. A failed harvest or destructive flood could signal spiritual misalignment. Leaders responded not by denial, but by intensified ritual, offerings, ceremonies, and consultation with shamans to restore harmony. This accountability restrained excess. Power remained conditional, tied to service rather than entitlement. Children grew into this worldview naturally. They learned through observation, participation, and story. There was no moment when belief was taught formally. It was absorbed gradually, like language. Over time, this spiritual system became one of the Olmec's greatest legacies. Later, Mesoamerican civilizations inherited its core ideas: layered cosmos, sacred landscapes, ritual leadership, and the integration of belief with daily life. Though names and symbols changed, the structure remained. The Olmecs had shaped a spiritual grammar. It allowed future cultures to express their own beliefs within a shared framework of meaning. Even as Olmec political centres declined, their spiritual influence endured. Ritual practices persisted. Symbols reappeared. The jaguar continued to stalk imagination. Sacred mountains continued to rise from flat land. This persistence speaks to the depth of Olmec belief. It was not imposed, it resonated. The Olmecs did not attempt to explain the universe fully. They accepted mystery as part of existence. Their spirituality offered guidance rather than answers, balance rather than certainty, and in doing so, they created a way of seeing the world that would echo across centuries, a quiet understanding that humans live within a living system, not above it. Their gods were not distant rulers. They were forces moving through rain, stone, animal, and dream. And through ritual, respect, and remembrance, the Olmecs learned how to live among them. Jade, trade, and the wealth of the Olmec heartland. In the Olmec world, wealth was not loud. It did not announce itself through towering palaces or endless accumulation. Instead, it moved quietly, carried by rivers, shaped by skilled hands, and buried carefully beneath sacred earth. Wealth flowed, rather than sat still, and its value lay as much in meaning as in material. At the heart of this system was jade. Jade did not come from the Olmec lowlands. It had to be brought from distant highland regions far to the south and east, places separated by mountains, forests, and long stretches of river. Obtaining it required effort, trust, and relationships maintained over generations. This distance made jade powerful. Its rarity was not only physical, but experiential. Each piece represented a journey, across landscapes, through communities, along waterways that connected worlds. To hold jade was to hold proof of connection beyond the visible horizon. The Olmecs valued jade not for its shine alone, but for what it symbolized. Its green colour echoed life, maize, fertility, and renewal. Its hardness suggested endurance. Unlike wood or clay, jade resisted decay. It endured, much like stone, but with a living colour that felt closer to breath and blood. Jade objects were shaped with extraordinary care. Celts, beads, figurines and ritual items were polished slowly, patiently, often taking countless hours to complete. This labour transformed raw stone into sacred substance. The process itself carried meaning, discipline, focus, and respect. These objects were not everyday possessions. They were worn during ritual, passed between generations, or offered to the unseen. Many were never meant to be seen again once buried. Their value was fulfilled in giving, not display. Trade networks made this possible. Rivers served as arteries of exchange, carrying goods, people, and ideas across vast distances. Canoes moved quietly along familiar routes, stopping at known gathering points. Exchange was personal, built on relationships rather than markets. Goods travelled both ways. From the Olmec heartland flowed crafted items, symbolic knowledge, and ritual forms. In return came jade, obsidian, shells, feathers, and other materials unavailable locally. Each exchange reinforced interdependence. Trade was not driven solely by need, it was driven by connection. Through trade, the Olmecs positioned themselves as cultural mediators. Their centres became hubs where materials were transformed, not just physically, but symbolically. Raw jade became sacred artifact, obsidian became ritual blade, shell became ornament charged with meaning. This transformation increased value. The Olmecs did not merely receive wealth, they reshaped it. Control over this process brought influence. Those who managed trade routes, organised exchanges, and distributed valuable items gained authority. Yet this authority was tempered by belief. Hoarding threatened balance. Excess wealth required ritual redistribution. Wealth was cyclical. Objects moved from hand to hand, from surface to earth, from living to ancestral realm. Nothing was meant to remain static. Even everyday goods reflected this worldview. Clay vessels were crafted not only for utility, but for aesthetic harmony. Patterns echoed cosmological symbols. Tools were shaped carefully, balancing function and form. This attention to material culture reinforced identity. People recognized Olmec craftsmanship immediately. Styles spread across regions, becoming markers of shared affiliation. To possess an Olmec-style object was to participate in a wider cultural system. Trade also spread ideas. Ritual practices, symbolic motifs, and social structures travelled alongside goods. Communities far from the Olmec heartland adopted elements of Olmec belief, integrating them into local traditions. This influence expanded without conquest. There is little evidence of Olmec armies imposing control. Instead, their wealth system encouraged voluntary alignment. Participation brought access to trade, ritual legitimacy, and cultural connection. The heartland prospered quietly. Agricultural surplus supported craft specialists. Trade networks supplied rare materials. Ritual centres attracted people and offerings. Wealth accumulated, but remained embedded in social and spiritual systems. This integration prevented extremes. Economic power could not detach itself from belief. Every valuable object carried responsibility. Every exchange reinforced relationship. The Olmecs understood that wealth, like water, must flow. When it stagnated, imbalance followed. By embedding trade within ritual and meaning, they created a system resilient to change. Even when centres declined or routes shifted, relationships endured. Jade buried centuries ago still lies beneath Olmec soil. It rests not as lost treasure, but as fulfilled offering, its purpose completed, its meaning intact. Through jade, trade, and careful balance, the Olmecs built a heartland rich not only in material, but in connection, a wealth measured in relationships, memory, and continuity. As jade, obsidian, shell, and stone continued to circulate through the Olmec heartland, trade became more than exchange. It became structure. The movement of goods shaped how communities related to one another, how leaders gained legitimacy, and how the Olmec world held itself together across distance and time. Trade routes were not straight lines on a map. They followed rivers that bent and branched, wetlands that opened and closed with the seasons, and mountain passes remembered through story rather than marker. Knowledge of these routes was precious. It was learned through experience, passed down carefully, and guarded through trust rather than secrecy. Travel was slow and deliberate. Canoes moved with currents rather than against them. Journeys were planned around water levels, weather, and ritual calendars. Along the way, travellers stopped at familiar communities, renewing alliances through gift exchange, shared meals, and ritual participation. These encounters reinforced bonds. Trade was never anonymous. Each exchange reaffirmed relationship. A jade bead carried not only material value, but memory of who gave it, under what circumstances, and with what intention. This memory mattered. Objects accumulated histories. A jade celt passed through several hands became layered with meaning, each transfer adding to its story. By the time it was offered ceremonially or buried, it embodied far more than stone. Craft specialists held respected roles within this system. They were not isolated artisans working for elites alone. They were integrated members of community, supported by surplus and trusted with transforming raw materials into meaningful forms. Their skill connected distant landscapes to local ritual. Polishing jade required patience bordering on devotion. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. Each stroke removed only a trace of material. This slow transformation mirrored the Olmec understanding of value. That worth was created through care and time rather than speed. The finished object carried that time within it. Obsidian, sharp and reflective, travelled from volcanic regions far from the Olmec lowlands. Its cutting edge made it useful, but its sheen made it symbolic. Blades were both tools and ritual instruments, capable of sustaining life or opening passages between realms. Shells from distant coasts arrived shaped by waves and time. Their presence inland carried the sound of the sea, connecting forest and water worlds. When worn or buried, shells symbolized fertility, continuity, and the vastness beyond immediate surroundings. Through these materials, the Olmecs built a worldview that extended far beyond their forests and rivers. They knew they were part of a larger world, even if they did not seek to dominate it. Wealth accumulation followed ritual logic. High-value objects were often redistributed during ceremonies, reinforcing social cohesion. Leaders gained status not by hoarding, but by giving, hosting gatherings, sponsoring rituals, and facilitating offerings. Generosity signaled alignment with cosmic balance. To give freely was to demonstrate trust in renewal. To withhold excessively was to risk disruption. This ethic restrained inequality. While social hierarchy existed, it remained moderated by obligation. Leaders were expected to use wealth in service of community and ritual. Failure to do so threatened legitimacy. Buried offerings represent the culmination of this system. When jade, obsidian, and other valuables were placed beneath plazas or mounds, they were removed permanently from circulation. This act reaffirmed that the highest value lay not in possession, but in sacrifice. These offerings stabilized belief. They marked moments of transition, the dedication of a structure, the close of a cycle, the renewal of cosmic order. By giving wealth to the earth, the Olmecs reaffirmed their place within it. Trade networks also carried people. Marriages linked distant communities. Ritual specialists travelled, sharing knowledge and practices. Over time, this movement blended regional differences into a shared Olmec identity. This identity was flexible. Local traditions persisted, but they were framed within a common symbolic language. This balance allowed expansion without erasure. The Olmec heartland thrived because it remained open to exchange, open to influence, open to adaptation. Wealth flowed through it, but never overwhelmed it. Even when environmental or political changes disrupted specific routes, the system endured. Relationships adapted, new paths formed, value shifted form, but not function. The Olmecs had built an economy of meaning. Material wealth supported spiritual life. Spiritual belief guided material exchange. Neither existed alone. This integration explains the depth of Olmec influence. Later civilizations inherited not just symbols, but systems, ways of connecting, valuing, and remembering. They learned that power could move quietly, carried by rivers and relationships rather than armies. Long after Olmec centres declined, jade continued to appear in ritual contexts. Its meaning endured because it had never been merely decorative. It had always been relational. Through jade, trade, and careful balance, the Olmecs shaped a heartland rich in connection, a world where wealth was measured not by what was kept, but by what was shared, offered, and remembered. And as rivers continued to flow through forest and wetland, they carried this quiet wealth onward into the future of Mesoamerica. Art, symbols, and the origins of Mesoamerican writing. In the Olmec world, art was not decoration, it was language. Long before words were carved into stone or inked onto bark, meaning was shaped through image, form, and repetition. To see an Olmec carving was not simply to admire craftsmanship, it was to encounter a way of thinking made visible. The Olmecs lived in a world where much could not be spoken directly. The forces that governed life, rain, fertility, illness, transformation, death, were powerful and unpredictable. Explaining them required more than speech. It required symbol. Art became the bridge between experience and understanding. Every material carried meaning. Stone endured and remembered. Jade lived and breathed with colour. Clay held daily life in its hands. Shell echoed distant waters. The Olmecs chose materials carefully, aligning substance with message. Art emerged everywhere. It appeared in monumental sculpture, in small figurines, in carved celts, in incised stones buried beneath plazas. It appeared on objects meant to be seen, and on offerings meant to be hidden forever. Visibility did not determine importance. Meaning did. Symbols repeated across distance and time. Certain forms became familiar. The cleft head, the downturned mouth, almond-shaped eyes, crossed bands, and jaguar traits blended with human features. These were not random designs. They were visual vocabulary, understood through shared cultural memory. The cleft in the head, for example, echoed maize splitting the earth as it grows. It symbolized fertility, emergence, and renewal. To carve it into stone was to connect human identity to the cycle of life itself. The jaguar human figure appeared again and again. It represented transformation, the ability to move between worlds. These figures did not depict literal creatures. They expressed spiritual states. They showed what could be rather than what was. In this way, Olmec art taught belief. One did not need explanation. Recognition came through repetition. Over time, symbols became intuitive, embedded deeply in communal understanding. Art also structured authority. Rulers and ritual leaders were depicted with specific traits, posture, expression, attire, that communicated legitimacy. These images did not show action or conquest. They showed composure, balance, and connection to the sacred. The calm faces of stone echoed the calm required of leadership. Through art, power was normalized and accepted, not imposed. As these symbols spread through trade and ritual networks, they formed a shared visual language across Mesoamerica. Communities far from the Olmec heartland recognized these forms and incorporated them into local expression. This spread laid the groundwork for writing. Before writing records events, it records ideas. The Olmecs had already done this visually. They had created a symbolic system capable of conveying complex concepts without sound. Over time, some symbols became more abstract. Images were simplified. Lines and shapes replaced detailed figures. These abstractions allowed meaning to be conveyed quickly and consistently. A symbol no longer needed full depiction to be understood. This shift marks the threshold between art and writing. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence for early Olmec writing is the cascajal block, a stone slab carved with a sequence of symbols unlike any other known system. The symbols repeat. They appear ordered. They suggest structure rather than decoration. Whether this represents true writing remains debated. What is clear is that the Olmecs were experimenting with recording meaning beyond image alone. They were moving toward inscription, fixing knowledge in place. This impulse aligns with broader Olmec culture. As civilization grew more complex, memory needed support. Ritual calendars, lineage, offerings, and authority all required continuity. Symbols offered stability where oral memory alone could falter. Yet even as symbolic systems developed, the Olmecs did not abandon embodied knowledge. Art was meant to be encountered physically, walked around, touched, buried, revealed. Meaning remained tied to place and action. Writing, if it existed, did not replace ritual. It complemented it. This balance shaped later Mesoamerican civilizations profoundly. The Maya, Zapotec, and others developed full writing systems, but they retained Olmec principles, symbols tied to cosmology, art integrated with belief, text embedded in ritual space. The Olmecs showed that meaning could be carved into the world itself. Stone could speak without sound. Image could carry memory without voice. Art, symbol, and early inscription together formed a foundation, one that allowed future cultures to record time, power, and belief in increasingly complex ways. But it began quietly, with a carved line, with a repeated form, with an image understood not through explanation, but through recognition. In the Olmec world, to see was to know, and through art and symbol, the Olmecs taught Mesoamerica how to remember. As these symbols settled into collective memory, they began to function in ways that went beyond representation. They organized thought, they structured ritual, they guided behavior. The Olmecs were not merely creating images, they were shaping a mental landscape shared across generations. Repetition was essential. A symbol seen once might intrigue, but a symbol seen repeatedly became instruction. Carved on stone, moulded in clay, incised on jade, and echoed in ritual gesture, Olmec symbols surrounded daily life. Over time, meaning became instinctive. One did not need explanation to understand the cleft head, the jaguar mouth, or the crossed bands. Recognition was enough. This familiarity allowed symbols to grow more efficient. Details were reduced without losing meaning. A full figure could be suggested by a single feature. A complex myth could be referenced by a single mark. This compression of meaning is a crucial step toward writing, the ability to convey ideas quickly through agreed signs. The Olmecs seem to have understood this intuitively. Their symbols were flexible. They could appear alone or in combination. They could be carved large for public display or small for personal ritual. They could be visible or hidden, permanent or ephemeral. This adaptability made the system resilient. Symbols did not depend on a single medium or location. They travelled easily, carried by objects, memory and performance. Even when centres declined or population shifted, the symbolic language persisted. Art also preserved hierarchy. Certain symbols were reserved for ritual leaders or rulers. Specific combinations of motifs signalled authority and spiritual alignment. These visual cues allowed social roles to be recognised instantly, even by those who had never met the individual depicted. This reduced conflict. When authority is visually legible, it requires less enforcement. The Olmecs relied on recognition rather than coercion. Art became a tool of governance without violence. The Cascajal block remains a compelling example of how far this system may have progressed. The carved symbols on its surface appear arranged deliberately, suggesting order rather than ornament. Some symbols repeat, others appear only once. The arrangement implies sequence, perhaps recording names, events, offerings, or ritual formulas. If this was writing, it was writing born from art. It did not emerge from accounting or administration alone. It emerged from a need to preserve meaning tied to ritual and identity. This aligns with the Olmec worldview. Knowledge worth recording was sacred knowledge. Memory mattered most when it supported balance and continuity. Even if full writing remained rare or experimental, the symbolic groundwork was complete. Later cultures would expand it. The Zapotec developed early inscriptions tied to lineage and place. The Maya created a sophisticated writing system capable of recording history, astronomy, and myth. These systems did not arise in isolation. They built upon Olmec foundations. The visual language, the way symbols were combined, the integration of text and image, the placement of inscriptions in sacred space, all reflect Olmec influence. Art continued to shape thought long after Olmec centres declined. Symbols migrated into new forms, adapted to new languages and beliefs, yet their core meanings endured: fertility, transformation, authority, continuity. This endurance reveals something profound. The Olmecs did not need writing to create civilization. They created civilization that made writing possible. Their art taught people how to think symbolically, how to store meaning outside the mind, how to share understanding across time and distance. Art became memory, and memory became culture. In the quiet presence of carved stone and buried offerings, the Olmecs left instructions for the future, not written commands, but visual guidance. They showed later civilizations how to see the world as layered, connected, and meaningful. To walk among Olmec symbols was to walk among ideas, ideas that did not demand explanation, ideas that did not rush, ideas that waited patiently to be understood. Through art and symbol, the Olmecs taught Mesoamerica how to remember itself, and in doing so, they shaped the very possibility of history. Their images still speak, not loudly, not directly, but clearly, to those who know how to look. Rituals, power, and the Olmec elite. In the Olmec world, power did not announce itself with noise or spectacle. It settled quietly into ritual, gesture, and presence. Authority was not seized, it was recognized. It emerged through the careful alignment of human action with cosmic order, and it was sustained by the belief that balance, once achieved, must be constantly renewed. The Olmec elite were not defined solely by wealth or lineage. They were defined by responsibility. To lead was to maintain harmony between people, land, and unseen forces. This responsibility shaped every aspect of elite life: how leaders dressed, where they lived, how they moved through sacred space, and how they participated in ritual. Ritual was the foundation of power. Ceremonies marked transitions, seasons, leadership changes, construction phases, and moments of crisis. Through ritual, leaders demonstrated their ability to communicate with the sacred, to interpret signs, and to act in ways believed to preserve cosmic balance. Participation mattered more than command. When elites stood at the centre of ritual spaces, they were not separate from the community. They were visible conduits. Their presence affirmed continuity. Their actions reassured the gathered people that order was being maintained. The Olmec elite understood the power of restraint. Their images in art do not show dramatic action. They are calm, composed, inward-looking. This stillness communicated control, not over others, but over self. In a world shaped by unpredictable floods and storms, composure was a form of strength. Dress reinforced this message. Elite figures were depicted wearing symbolic headgear, ornaments, and regalia made from jade, shell, and stone. These items did not glitter excessively. They signaled connection rather than excess, ties to ancestors, ritual roles, and sacred narratives. Each element carried meaning. A jade pendant referenced fertility and life. A carved belt symbolized authority and responsibility. A specific headdress connected the wearer to mythic figures or ancestral lines. Together, these items formed a visual language of legitimacy. Ritual spaces reinforced hierarchy subtly. Elevated platforms placed elites physically above gatherings, not to dominate, but to be seen clearly. This elevation mirrored cosmology, leaders standing between sky and earth, mediating forces rather than ruling them. Movement through these spaces was controlled. Approaches were narrow. Plazas opened gradually. Sight lines guided attention. The elite did not rush. Their slow movement amplified presence, encouraging reflection rather than excitement. Offerings played a central role in elite authority. Leaders sponsored the burial of jade caches, stone objects, and symbolic materials beneath plazas and mounds. These offerings demonstrated generosity and devotion. They were public acts of sacrifice, reinforcing the idea that elites gave rather than took. Once buried, these offerings were never retrieved. Their value was complete in the act of giving. This reinforced trust that leaders placed communal and cosmic needs above personal gain. The Olmec elite were also custodians of memory. They preserved lineage through oral tradition, ritual reenactment, and symbolic representation. Ancestors were honoured not as distant figures, but as active participants in present life. Leaders derived legitimacy from their connection to these remembered pasts. This connection was reinforced visually. Colossal heads likely represented specific elite individuals, rulers whose memory was anchored permanently in stone. Their continued presence legitimized successors, creating continuity without written record. Power flowed through time rather than being reset. This continuity reduced instability. Leadership transitions did not require disruption. Ritual affirmed succession as natural rather than contested. Yet elite power was not absolute. Environmental failure, ritual misalignment, or social imbalance could undermine authority. Leaders were accountable to outcomes. A failed harvest or destructive flood raised questions not of technique, but of spiritual alignment. In response, elites intensified ritual rather than repression. They organized ceremonies, offerings, and consultations with shamans to restore balance. This response reinforced their role as mediators rather than enforcers. The Olmec elite lived under constant observation. Their actions were witnessed not only by people, but by ancestors and gods. This belief imposed restraint. Excess threatened not only social stability, but cosmic order. This worldview limited tyranny. Power could not be separated from responsibility without consequence. As Olmec civilization expanded, elite roles became more specialized. Some focused on ritual leadership, others managed trade and exchange, others coordinated construction and labor. These roles overlapped, but together they formed a network of authority rather than a single center. This networked elite structure mirrored Olmec society itself. Decentralized, interconnected, flexible, it allowed adaptation when centers shifted or declined. Authority moved with ritual importance rather than remaining fixed. Through ritual, the Olmec elite shaped a model of leadership that would influence Mesoamerica for centuries. Later rulers would claim divine descent, build monuments, and record dynasties. But beneath these expressions lay Olmec principles: legitimacy through balance, power through ritual, authority through continuity. The Olmec elite did not rule by force, they ruled by alignment, and in doing so, they created a civilization where power was quiet, measured, and deeply woven into the fabric of belief. As ritual continued to shape authority, the lives of the Olmec elite unfolded within carefully constructed rhythms. Daily routines, ceremonial obligations, and seasonal observances were woven together so tightly that distinction between governance and spirituality all but disappeared. To lead was to participate continually in sacred time. Elite households were positioned with intention. They stood close to ceremonial centres, yet not at their very heart. This placement reflected balance, near enough to the sacred to serve it, distant enough to remain grounded in communal life. These households were larger and more complex than ordinary dwellings, but they were not ostentatious. Their spaces emphasized order. Rooms were arranged around central areas used for gathering, consultation, and preparation for ritual. Storage areas held ceremonial items alongside everyday tools, reinforcing the idea that sacred and ordinary life were not separate domains. Within these spaces, knowledge was transmitted quietly. Children of elite families learned ritual protocols through observation. They watched how elders prepared offerings, how they moved through ceremonial space, how they spoke during gatherings. Instruction was subtle, embedded in participation rather than command. Succession followed similar principles. Leadership was not inherited automatically. Lineage mattered, but so did perceived alignment. Elders, ritual specialists, and community consensus played roles in recognizing successors. Ritual confirmation mattered more than declaration. This process reduced conflict. Power transitions were framed as continuations rather than changes. The new leader stepped into an existing role, guided by ancestral presence rather than personal ambition. Ritual performance itself was carefully choreographed. Elites led processions, timed gestures, and offerings with deliberate slowness. This pace was not accidental. It created space for observation, reflection, and collective focus. Silence was often as important as sound. Music and rhythm guided participation. Drums, rattles, and percussive instruments marked transitions within ceremonies. Their steady patterns mirrored heartbeat and breath, grounding participants in shared experience. Elites did not perform alone. Ritual required community presence. Power was affirmed through visibility, but legitimacy depended on collective witnessing. A ceremony without observers held little meaning. This reliance on participation constrained authority. Leaders could not act in isolation. Ritual demanded transparency. Actions were seen, remembered, and evaluated. Offerings continued to anchor elite responsibility. These acts were costly. Jade, labour, time. They demonstrated commitment. A leader unwilling to sacrifice wealth or effort risked losing trust. Even the construction of monuments followed ritual logic. Large projects were not expressions of domination. They were communal undertakings, framed as sacred acts. Elites coordinated labour, but participation extended across social levels. Building became ritual in itself. Completion was marked by burial. Objects used during construction were often interred beneath structures. This act closed the process, sealing intention into earth and stone. Leaders ensured these acts were carried out properly, reinforcing their role as guardians of transition. Power also required listening. Elites consulted shamans, elders, and community members. Dreams, omens, and environmental signs informed decisions. Authority flowed through interpretation rather than decree. This attentiveness fostered resilience. When conditions changed, leadership adapted. Ritual frameworks allowed reinterpretation rather than rigid adherence. Balance could be restored through adjustment rather than force. Yet elite life was not without burden. Responsibility carried weight. Failure was public. Leaders bore blame for misfortune regardless of cause. This pressure reinforced humility and caution. It also reinforced continuity. No leader stood alone. They were part of a lineage, a ritual system, and a cosmic cycle larger than any individual. As Olmec civilization matured, these principles became deeply embedded. Even as centers shifted and populations moved, the model of ritual-based authority endured. Later Mesoamerican rulers adopted more elaborate forms, but the underlying structure remained Olmec. Power remained tied to sacred performance. Legitimacy remained tied to balance. Authority remained conditional. The Olmec elite left no written laws, no proclamations carved in triumph. They left patterns, patterns of movement, patterns of offering, patterns of restraint. Through ritual, they shaped a civilization where power was quiet, accountable, and deeply entwined with belief. A model that would echo long after their own names faded from memory. And in the stillness of ceremonial space, surrounded by stone, jade, and gathered community, Olmec authority found its voice, not in command, but in continuity. The Olmecs and the civilizations they shaped, long before names like Maya, Zapotec, or Teotihuacan would echo through history, the Olmecs had already set something in motion. Their cities were still active, their rituals ongoing, their rivers busy with trade, Yet the influence they were creating was already extending far beyond their own boundaries. The Olmecs did not build an empire. They did not conquer distant lands with armies or impose their rule through force. Instead, their influence travelled quietly, carried by objects, ideas, and shared ways of seeing the world. It moved slowly, like water through lowland forests, shaping everything it touched without announcing itself. This quiet influence was their greatest strength. Communities that encountered Olmec culture did not experience it as domination. They experienced it as possibility, new ways of organizing sacred space, new ways of imagining leadership, new ways of expressing belief through art and ritual. Across Mesoamerica, traces of Olmec thought began to appear. Ceremonial centers emerged that echoed Olmec layouts, open plazas surrounded by platforms, spaces designed not just for gathering, but for movement, procession, and ritual timing. These were not copied blindly. They were adapted, reshaped to fit local landscapes and traditions. Yet the underlying logic remained familiar. Sacred space was separated from ordinary space. Ritual activity was elevated physically and symbolically. The center of community life became the place where humans and the unseen world met. This idea spread widely. In the highlands of Oaxaca, early Zapotec communities began constructing ceremonial centers that reflected Olmec principles. Monte Alban, though distinct in form, carried forward the idea that political authority and sacred power were inseparable. Rulers were not merely administrators, they were mediators between worlds. This concept, central to Olmec belief, became foundational across Mesoamerica. Leaders gained legitimacy not only through lineage, but through their ability to perform ritual, sponsor offerings, and maintain balance between people and cosmos. The Maya would later expand this idea dramatically. Their kings bled themselves ritually, fasted, and performed ceremonies tied to cosmic cycles. Practices that echo Olmec understandings of leadership as sacrifice and responsibility rather than command. Writing and calendars made these practices more elaborate, but the spiritual framework beneath them was already ancient. Art carried Olmec influence even further. Jaguar imagery, human-animal transformation, cleft heads, and symbolic postures spread across regions. These motifs were not static symbols. They were flexible ideas, capable of adaptation to local myths while retaining shared meaning. Through art, people recognized one another. A carving in one region could be understood in another. A jade figure carried significance beyond its place of origin. This shared visual language created cultural continuity across vast distances. Trade networks amplified this process. Objects moved from the Olmec heartland into distant communities, carrying not only material value but symbolic meaning. Jade, obsidian, and crafted forms became vehicles for belief. Each exchange reinforced shared understanding. The Olmecs did not just trade goods, they traded ways of thinking. As these ideas spread, they shaped how communities responded to change. Environmental shifts, population movement, and social transformation were interpreted through ritual frameworks rather than chaos. Balance could be restored, cycles could continue. This worldview proved resilient. When one centre declined, others rose. When traditions shifted, core principles endured. The Olmec legacy allowed civilization to adapt without forgetting itself. Even the concept of time bore Olmec influence. Cycles mattered more than linear progression. Renewal mattered more than permanence. This understanding shaped later calendrical systems, ritual observances, and historical memory. The Olmecs had shown that civilization was not a fixed structure. It was a process, one that required constant attention, renewal, and participation. As centuries passed and Olmec political centres began to quiet, their influence did not fade. It detached itself from place. It became portable, embedded in ritual practice, artistic expression, and shared cosmology. Olmec ideas no longer needed Olmec cities to survive. They had already become Mesoamerican, and as new civilizations emerged, building higher, writing more, and ruling wider, they did so upon foundations laid long before, foundations shaped by a people who understood that the deepest power moves quietly and that influence lasts longest when it is shared rather than imposed. By the time later civilizations reached their height, the Olmecs themselves were already receding into memory. Their great centres no longer dominated the landscape, and their names were no longer spoken aloud. Yet this disappearance did not weaken their influence. In many ways, it strengthened it. What survives longest is not what is remembered clearly, but what becomes habitual. Olmec ideas had become habits of thought. Across Mesoamerica, people continued to build sacred centres that reflected Olmec principles without knowing their origin. Platforms rose where earth met sky. Plazas opened as communal spaces for ritual movement. Offerings were buried beneath stone, sealing intention into the ground. These practices no longer belong to one people, they belong to the land. Civilizations such as the Maya inherited a fully formed cosmological structure. The idea of a layered universe, heavens above, underworld below, and the human realm between, was already present. Sacred mountains, caves, and water sources retained their spiritual importance, echoing Olmec reverence for landscape as living force. Maya kings expanded ritual authority into elaborate ceremony. They carved histories, tracked time, and named ancestors, but their legitimacy still depended on performance, bloodletting, fasting, and offerings that mirrored Olmec expectations of sacrifice and balance. Power remained conditional. Failure still carried spiritual consequence. In central Mexico, later cultures absorbed Olmec influence in different ways. At Teotihuacan, ritual-centered urban planning dominated. The city itself functioned as a sacred instrument, aligned to cosmic directions and cycles. Though massive and organized, its spiritual logic reflected Olmec ideas of space as symbolic rather than purely functional. Even cultures that rejected overt kingship retained Olmec principles. Authority was distributed through ritual roles rather than centralized rule. Art continued to emphasize symbolic meaning over realism. Offerings remained central to renewal. This adaptability explains the endurance of Olmec influence. It did not depend on political survival. It depended on usefulness, on providing a framework that helped people understand their world. When drought struck, ritual explained suffering. When cities fell, cycles explained loss. When new leaders emerged, tradition explained legitimacy. The Olmecs had offered Mesoamerica a way to interpret uncertainty. This interpretation softened fear. Civilization was no longer a fragile achievement. It was a living process, capable of renewal after disruption. Even collapse became meaningful. When later cities were abandoned, they were not erased. They were remembered as sacred ruins, places where ancestors once stood. This reverence for ruins, this refusal to forget, can be traced back to Olmec ancestor veneration and ritual memory. The Olmecs also shaped artistic continuity. Styles evolved, symbols transformed, but core motifs persisted. Jaguars remained powerful. Human-animal transformation continued to express spiritual fluidity. Stone remained sacred, not merely structural. Writing, too, followed Olmec logic. Glyphs were not used simply to record events. They recorded sacred time, ritual acts, and cosmic relationships. Text remained bound to image and place, reflecting Olmec integration of meaning rather than separation. Perhaps the greatest testament to Olmec influence lies in what never changed. Across centuries and cultures, Mesoamerican civilization remained ritual-centered. Leadership remained sacred. Art remained symbolic. Time remained cyclical. These constants survived conquest, migration, and collapse. The Olmecs had not dictated these patterns. They had revealed them. By living within balance rather than enforcing control, they created a legacy that required no preservation. It preserved itself. Even today, archaeologists uncover Olmec influence not through inscriptions proclaiming dominance, but through quiet continuities, familiar forms appearing where no direct contact is recorded, shared meanings emerging across distance. This is the power of foundational culture. So it does not announce itself, it endures. The Olmecs were the first to show Mesoamerica how to become itself. They shaped not only what civilizations built, but how they thought, remembered, and renewed. Their legacy is not a chapter that ends. It is a current that flows beneath the entire history of the region. And though their own voices fell silent long ago, the world they shaped continues to speak through stone, ritual, and the enduring human need to find meaning within a living universe. The quiet decline of the Olmec world. The end of the Olmec world did not arrive with fire or conquest. There were no sudden invasions, no burning cities, no final battles carved into stone. Instead, the Olmec civilization faded the way mist lifts from a river at dawn, slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed. Life continued, even as change crept in. Ceremonial centres that once pulsed with ritual activity grew calmer. Gatherings became less frequent. Offerings were buried more rarely. The rhythms that had guided generations began to loosen, not through collapse, but through gradual transformation. The land itself began to change. Rivers shifted their courses, flooding some areas while leaving others dry. Wetlands expanded and receded unpredictably. The forest that had once provided abundance became more difficult to manage as soil conditions altered and familiar patterns no longer held. For a society deeply attuned to balance, these disruptions mattered. The Olmecs did not interpret environmental change as random. Shifts in water, soil, and climate signalled imbalance, a sign that cycles were misaligned. Ritual responses intensified at first, as leaders and shamans sought to restore harmony. Offerings continued. Stone, jade, and symbolic objects were buried with care, sometimes in greater quantity than before. These acts suggest effort, a society trying to correct something slipping beyond its control. But ritual alone could not redirect rivers. As agricultural reliability declined in some regions, populations began to move. Families relocated to more stable land. Small communities drifted away from the great ceremonial centres, seeking livelihoods elsewhere. This movement was not panic-driven, it was adaptive. The Olmecs had always understood change as part of life. When the land no longer supported large concentrations of people, society adjusted rather than resisted. San Lorenzo, once a powerful centre, had already declined earlier. Venta, too, eventually lost its central role. Not abandoned suddenly, but slowly. As fewer people gathered, fewer rituals were held, and the importance of the site diminished over time. Structures were not violently destroyed. They were left to weather, sink, and soften back into the landscape. Earth covered stone. Forests reclaimed plazas. Sacred space returned to nature. Leadership, once anchored in these centres, became more diffuse. Authority shifted to smaller communities and local ritual leaders. The grand, centralised expressions of Olmec power gave way to regional traditions shaped by inherited ideas rather than unified control. This transition did not erase Olmec identity. It transformed it. People carried beliefs, symbols, and practices with them as they moved. Jaguar imagery persisted. Ritual burial continued. Sacred landscapes remained important. The Olmec worldview travelled even as Olmec cities fell silent. Trade networks changed as well. Long-distance exchange became less concentrated. Routes fragmented. Local trade replaced large-scale movement of goods. Jade became rarer in some areas, but its symbolic value endured. The decline was uneven. Some regions remained active longer than others. Some traditions persisted for generations. There was no single moment when the Olmec world ended, only a long series of quiet adjustments. This gradual fading left little for later cultures to record. Without written histories describing collapse, the Olmecs slipped into obscurity. Their decline left no dramatic story for later peoples to remember, only foundations beneath their own civilizations. This absence is telling. The Olmecs did not define themselves through conquest or permanence. They defined themselves through balance. When balance shifted beyond recovery, they adapted, dispersed, and transformed. In this way, their decline mirrored their philosophy. Nothing was meant to last forever in fixed form. Renewal required release. The Olmec world did not end. It dissolved, and in dissolving, it became part of everything that followed. As the great Olmec centres slipped further into quiet, what remained was not absence, but continuity in another form. The people did not vanish. They changed how they lived, where they gathered, and how they remembered. Memory became local, without large ceremonial hubs drawing distant communities together. Ritual life shifted closer to home. Smaller sacred places emerged, hills, springs, caves, and clearings that carried meaning without monumentality. The sacred no longer required stone platforms. It lived in familiar landscapes. This decentralization altered identity. Rather than belonging to a single cultural centre, people identified with regional traditions shaped by Olmec inheritance. Beliefs adapted to new environments, yet retained familiar structures, cycles, offerings, ancestor reverence, and transformation. The Olmec way of seeing the world endured quietly. Children still learned through participation. Stories still connected humans to animals and land. Rituals still marked planting, harvest, and transition. The form changed, but the rhythm remained. Artifacts tell this story. Later communities continued to create objects bearing Olmec-style motifs long after the centres declined. These were not imitations of a lost past. They were living expressions of continuity, evidence that Olmec ideas had become embedded in daily life. Over time, new cultural identities emerged. What we now call the Olmecs dissolved into broader Mesoamerican traditions. Their name faded, but their influence did not. It became indistinguishable from culture itself. This kind of disappearance is rare. Civilizations often fall loudly, leaving ruins and records of conflict. The Olmecs faded softly, leaving foundations instead of endings. Their silence allowed others to speak. Later civilizations did not see themselves as inheritors of a fallen empire. They saw themselves as participants in a living tradition. This perspective encouraged innovation rather than nostalgia. The Olmecs had created a cultural language flexible enough to survive without them. This flexibility ensured survival. When later cultures faced upheaval, drought, migration, conquest, they drew upon Olmec-derived frameworks to reinterpret change. Ritual restored meaning. Cycles explained loss. Balance promised renewal. Even when foreign powers arrived centuries later, the deep structures endured. Colonial disruption altered surface expressions, but underlying beliefs persisted in adapted forms. Sacred landscapes remained sacred. Cycles continued to matter. Art retained symbolic depth. The Olmec decline was not failure, it was transition. Their civilization did not collapse because it did not depend on rigid systems. It depended on relationships. between people, land, and unseen forces. These relationships could move, change, and adapt. This adaptability was their final legacy. By refusing permanence, they achieved endurance. Today, the Olmec world is encountered through silence, in moss-covered stone, in buried offerings, in motifs that reappear centuries later. Their absence invites reflection rather than spectacle. They remind us that influence does not require dominance, that civilizations do not need to last forever to matter forever. The Olmecs stepped back without erasing themselves. They allowed the world they shaped to continue without their name, and in doing so, they became something rare in history, a civilization that ended not in collapse, but in quiet continuity, woven invisibly into everything that followed. The legacy the Olmecs left behind. Long after the last Olmec ceremonial fires dimmed, long after forests covered their plazas and rivers shifted away from their cities, something essential remained. It lingered not in names or chronicles, but in ways of thinking, seeing, and believing. The Olmecs left behind no written history of themselves, yet their legacy shaped the history of an entire region. Their greatest gift was not a monument, it was a framework. The Olmecs taught Mesoamerica how to imagine civilization itself. They demonstrated that society could be organized around ritual rather than force, around balance rather than domination. Power, in their world, did not need to shout, it needed to align. This idea endured. Across centuries, rulers would rise and fall, cities would be built and abandoned, but the expectation remained. Authority must be justified through sacred action. Leaders must perform. They must offer. They must prove alignment with forces larger than themselves. This principle shaped kingship from the Maya lowlands to the highlands of Oaxaca. Even when rulers claimed divine ancestry, they remained accountable to ritual cycles and cosmic order, a direct inheritance from Olmec belief. The Olmecs also left behind a visual language. Through art and symbol, they taught later cultures how to communicate meaning beyond words. Jaguar imagery, transformation motifs, sacred postures, and symbolic geometry became part of a shared vocabulary understood across distance and time. This visual language made writing possible, not because the Olmecs perfected writing, but because they taught people how to think symbolically, how to compress meaning into form, how to recognize ideas without explanation. Later scripts grew from this soil. Their understanding of landscape endured as well. Mountains, caves, rivers and wetlands remained sacred long after Olmec centers vanished. The belief that land itself was alive, responsive, and deserving of respect became a cornerstone of Mesoamerican spirituality. This belief shaped settlement patterns. Cities were placed with intention. Ritual sites aligned with natural features. Offerings were returned to the earth. Humans lived within the landscape, not above it. The Olmecs also shaped how time was understood. Cycles mattered more than straight lines. Renewal mattered more than permanence. Decline was not failure, it was transition. This understanding allowed later civilizations to survive disruption without losing meaning. Collapse became comprehensible. When drought struck or cities emptied, ritual offered explanation and renewal rather than despair. The Olmec legacy gave people tools to endure uncertainty. Even trade and economy bore their mark. Value remained tied to meaning. Jade mattered because it symbolized life and continuity, not because it glittered. Wealth flowed through ritual and exchange rather than accumulation. This ethic tempered inequality and reinforced community. Perhaps, most importantly, the Olmecs showed that civilization could end without being erased. They did not cling to permanence. They allowed transformation. In doing so, they ensured that what mattered most would survive. Their disappearance was not a loss, it was a diffusion. They became ancestors without names, present everywhere and nowhere at once. Today, when we stand before a colossal stone head or a buried jade offering, we are not simply looking at artifacts. We are encountering a way of understanding the world, one that values balance over conquest, memory over monument, and continuity over control. The Olmecs remind us that the deepest influence is often the quietest, that civilizations do not need to dominate history to shape it, that meaning can outlast cities, and belief can outlive names. They left behind no final declaration, only echoes, echoes carried in stone and symbol, in ritual and rhythm, in the enduring human search for balance within a living world. And in those echoes, the Olmecs remain, not as a people frozen in the past, but as a presence woven into the foundations of everything that followed. Those echoes continue even now, long after the Olmecs themselves slipped beyond memory. They move quietly through time, not demanding attention, but rewarding those who listen closely. The Olmecs left behind an idea that civilization does not begin with walls or armies, but with meaning. They showed that people could gather first to remember, to honour, to align themselves with forces they could not control. Only later would cities rise, laws be written, and power formalized. At the beginning stood ritual, shared belief, and a deep attentiveness to the world. This beginning shaped everything that followed. Later, civilizations inherited the Olmec understanding that humans are not separate from nature. Rain was not just weather. Stone was not just material. Animals were not merely hunted or feared. All were participants in a living system that required respect. This worldview endured beneath changing names and languages. Even when writing flourished, when empires expanded, when conflict intensified, the Olmec sense of balance remained embedded beneath the surface, guiding how people rebuilt after collapse, how they explained suffering, how they renewed hope. The Olmecs also left behind patience. Their monuments were not hurried, their art was not rushed, their rituals unfolded slowly, allowing meaning to settle rather than overwhelm. This patience became part of the cultural rhythm of Mesoamerica, shaping how time itself was experienced. Time was not something to conquer, it was something to move within. This perspective softened endings. When Olmec centers fell silent, there was no final rupture, no sharp line between past and future. Instead, there was continuity, a gentle passing of ideas from one generation to the next. The Olmecs did not disappear from history. History grew around them. Their influence became so foundational that it no longer needed attribution. Like grammar in a language, it shaped expression without being noticed. Today, scholars trace Olmec influence through stone, symbol, and space. But their truest legacy cannot be excavated. It lives in the understanding that civilization is not only about progress, but about relationship, with land, with ancestors, with the unseen, and with time itself. The Olmecs remind us that greatness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it listens, sometimes it adapts, sometimes it steps aside so others may continue the work. In the end, the Olmecs did not leave behind an empire to be remembered. They left behind a way of being, and as long as humans gather to mark seasons, to create meaning through symbol, and to seek balance within a changing world, that legacy quietly endures, steady, patient, and alive beneath the surface of history. As our journey through the Olmec world comes to rest, we're left not with clear endings, but with quiet echoes, in stone, in symbol, and in the civilizations that followed. If you found this story calming or enlightening, please like the video and subscribe for more long-form history to relax and unwind with. And before you drift away, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you, wherever you are in the world.